Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We're so fortunate today to be joined by the fantastic director, Joe Gantz, who is the director of Race to Save the World. And I was really interested in your filmmaking style because you describe it very much as a life in process, where you tend to allow a story to really unfold in front of you. And so because of that, and with that in mind, I was really interested in what the development process looks like and what are the details that are really important for you to already have mapped out before you go into that more kind of like ethereal place where you're able to just build a rapport with your subjects and sit back and see what you capture in the moment.
Well, I have a saying that there's three rules to documentary filmmaking: casting, casting, and casting. So I try to, find the right person or family to begin with. And it's hard to define what that is. It's someone who's comfortable with the process. And, you can't put your finger on what that is. It's just, it's different for every documentary. But once we pick our subjects, I like to just fade into the background and let it kind of unfold organically and not interfere, and then sort of create the story in the editing. But what I do is I spend a lot of time with subjects, a lot of time that I know will never be in the film. So when you spend a lot of time like that, they get comfortable with you being around. And then when something happens that's important or resonates, if that happens, it tends to be very intimate and authentic. And that's what I try to accomplish.
And I like that you akin it to casting in a sense, because that's often not a way that people describe it within documentary filmmaking, but it's that same idea and process, like you said, about finding people who are going to be really comfortable in front of the camera and tell the right story that you want to capture. And so to that point, I actually wanted to ask you about the casting process for this film, because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of stories and subjects that you could have pulled into this film to tell this particular story. And you really found subjects from a variety of different backgrounds that bring a lot of different perspectives and are involved in climate activism in a lot of different ways across the country. So what was that journey of really seeking out these stories and finding them all across the country in that way?
Well, I'm sure I could have found people who were right for this film in many different cities around the country, and certainly in many countries around the world. At one point when I started this, I envisioned being filming in other countries, but that I barely could raise the money to film in this country, so that was not possible. But I started out this film thinking that I was going to follow people who were doing anything to help save the world from climate change, and that included scientists who are coming up with alternative energy solutions, journalists, some professors who had written books or whatnot. And as time went on, I decided that I wasn't going to include scientists because potentially they could make a tremendous amount of money if they came up with a new solution. And so I couldn't be certain of how committed they were to climate change versus making a fortune. And then as I worked further, I didn't want people who were kind of making their living from dealing with climate change, talking about climate change, even though they were very well-intentioned, intelligent people. I wanted people who were in the trenches doing anything and everything they could. They were not able to tune it out like most people. And it created all kinds of issues with their work, with their family. But still, they had no choice but to charge in and do whatever they could. I found those folks and their spirit so uplifting and inspiring, and that's who I ended up going with.
And to that point as well, you really capture a thread and plethora of stories which bring forward the concept of showing up physically with your body and the impact that that can have in completely different ways. Going back to the 70s when millions of people took to the streets and the impact that that had on Reagan, and the fact that we have environmental protection laws as a result of that, down to what does it mean to have a group of people kayak into the water and stop a boat? What does it mean to have a group of people march across the country and the impact that that can have? And so I wanted to ask you about the way in which that's such a constant thread across these stories, and the consciousness in really capturing that conversation around physically showing up and how much of an impact it can have.
Well, there's people that say that one person can't make a difference, or even a few people or a group of people can't make a difference relative to what governments can do and have to do to turn this around. And that may be true if you compare the two. But the fact is, from my perspective, that, probably over 2/3 of this country believes that climate change is something that is going to affect everyone's lives. And unless we jump in and do everything we can now, it's going to be too late. And we have to act and do what we can to turn this around. But probably less than 1/3 of politicians believe this, or even if they believe it, they aren't acting on it because they're influenced by wealthy corporations and the fossil fuel industry. So people need to get involved to get the politicians involved, because without that pressure, I don't think they're going to change, and certainly not fast enough to make the huge kind of changes in the way we deal with fossil fuels and alternative energy. These need to happen now, and they need to happen in huge ways that is going to take a commitment from everybody. And so the people need to get in the street in huge numbers and make their voices heard in order to make sure that the politicians get on board.
Yeah. And then I also wanted to ask you about the journey of capturing a lot of these actions in very different ways. When we go back to the kayakers in the water stopping a boat, there's a lot of, it looks like there's a lot of drone camera work, and obviously your camera can't be right up in the center of the action because you're not in the water. And then at the same time, when there's an action where it's a group of people protesting outside of a building and people start being arrested, the camera's right up in the center of that. So how much were you able to map out how you were going to capture these moments in advance versus how much you really just had to be adjustable and be able to pivot in the moment to capture the story as it was unfolding?
Well, my style of filmmaking, where I try to be there as events unfold, it's hard to juggle, even when I'm working on a documentary where everybody will tell me what is happening way in advance. So my last film was on stem cell research and regenerative medicine. It was called Ending Disease. So I followed all these clinical trials. I knew weeks in advance, sometimes several weeks in advance, what was happening. I could organize my crew, get them there. In this film, we were dealing with direct action, civil disobedience, and often the people involved in that didn't want the authorities to know in advance, and they tried to keep me from knowing, or anybody from knowing, and I had to scramble at the last minute to show up at the right time. So it could get very chaotic, and it was quite a difficult film to make for that reason. But I tried to be there at the important moments, and in this film, I did use some footage shot not by my crew, and I think it was the first time I've done that in a film. There were people who had shot things, and I wasn't able to be there for that moment, or I didn't have the perspective as close as they did. You'll see that some of the footage is less than perfectly shot, but it didn't matter because it was in the moment and it captured the spirit of what was going on.
Yeah. And you touched upon this a little bit before in talking about the rapport and the relationship that you like to build with everybody who's participating prior to when you're filming, and then the way that you like to film a lot of moments in between. But you really captured a huge amount of intimacy with a lot of these families in particular. And the story that you're telling isn't just what does it mean for an individual to be an activist, it's also what's the impact that this has on a family. So we see a father who's an activist and his mother and daughter going, well, we're going to have dinner anyway because we don't know if you're going to make it home or not. We know that you might get arrested, and that's something that they've made peace with. And we see a couple where she's in the middle of court proceedings, and one of those outcomes could be jail, and they're talking about what would it mean to their family, what would that mean to their daughter if their mother ended up in jail because of her actions. And so I was interested in how much you knew about that aspect and the impacts that it was having on families before you went into filming from the conversations that you'd already had with them versus what just really unfurled in front of the camera from people feeling that comfortable with you in the room with them?
Well, I worked on this film probably for 3 years before I came up with the nucleus of the subjects that I was going to follow. So by the time I had the group that I was going to finish the film with, and some of them I had been working with for a year or so already, I knew that it took a lot to be this committed to fighting climate change. And especially if you're just a regular person and you're trying to juggle, a tremendous amount of time that you put into, the movement, and you have a family and you have a job and you have to make a living, that it was very difficult. So I was aware of that. And I did want to capture that, because I think that the main thing in a film is to make the subjects, authentic and relatable. And it's sort of like you get drawn into the subject and the family and the story, and then you get to care about the issue. So I think that as the film goes on, you really, you care about Abby and what she's dealing with her family. I mean, her husband, Roger, says, you just, you never told me that you were going to get arrested. I'm just hearing this now in the interview that you wanted to get arrested and you wanted to go to jail. So there's a lot goes into this. And I think the human side of it is what's sometimes the most interesting.
And within the human side as well, you also look at characters like Abby and a lot of other subjects in the film and the bureaucracy that comes with it. What does it mean to be arrested? What does it mean to be in the middle of those court proceedings? You have one of your subjects where the state is literally trying to paint him as a terrorist as their prosecution of him in their case. And so again, kind of similarly, I was interested in how much you knew about a lot of the bureaucracy that follows when activists are arrested, with everything that it takes from them. And again, the impact that has on them individually and their families.
I didn't know a lot about that when I started this film. I learned early on that if you do civil disobedience, like blocking a gate or something like that, and you get arrested, it's a misdemeanor. However, if you plan with another person to do an act of civil disobedience, you can be charged as a felony. So not all of these events, all of these protests where people get arrested, they are always planning it with a group of people, but they don't say that in advance. So when they get arrested, they're charged with a misdemeanor. But they told me early on that if I filmed it in advance and showed them planning it, that it could be charged as a felony. So I knew that, and I was careful to show the event and really not to film the planning in any ways, because I thought that could undermine things. But I was shocked still that someone like Michael, when he turned off the pipeline, the Keystone pipeline, he was originally charged with 81 years in prison. And that is shocking. This was something he did to draw attention to the fact that all this, dirty oil is coming into this country, and it, how dangerous that is. And, he did it for, a matter of a half hour or something, and then it was turned back on, and they charged him with 81 years in prison, which was later, reduced. But, they tried to make him out to be a terrorist. And I think they compared him to the Unabomber and others. That was surprising.
It's wild. There's literally murderers that get less time in sentencing than that.
Most murderers, I think.
Yeah. And I also thought one of the subjects that you touch upon in the film that was really interesting to think about that isn't often part of the conversation around climate activism is mental health. And you look at it from both ends of the spectrum. You have people who talk about how turning feelings into action is a really positive thing for them and for their emotional well-being, and it helps them to feel like they're really doing something with everything that they're wrestling with inside. And then at the same time, you also look at some of the stress and anxiety that can come with all of it, and even just that weight of the responsibility of learn, you know, the more you learn, the more stressful it is to just think about everything big picture, particularly with one of your teenage subjects, that it becomes quite overwhelming to him. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about the way in which you wanted to explore mental health and look at it from both sides of the spectrum in telling the story.
Well, I don't know that I went into this trying to explore mental health, but I think that that's always an important issue when it comes up. And Aji, who was 15 when we started the film, he talked about climate anxiety. And I think that's something that huge numbers of young people suffer from. They've grown up hearing and understanding that the world could be pretty much unlivable during their lifetimes. I mean, that's a huge thing to have to live with. On top of that, someone like Aji was a part of this lawsuit with the state of Washington to say that young people have a right to clean air and a clean environment. And so he feels somehow, I don't know about responsible, but he feels like he needs to do everything he can to try to stop this, that he's, if he can't, that weighs heavy on him. And they won the first level of that trial, and then it was kind of put into limbo, so nothing was accomplished. And he felt so frustrated that he had trouble sleeping and a lot of anxiety. And I think people can relate to that.
I was also really interested in the post-production on this film, particularly when thinking about the amount of footage that you filmed and how you consciously, as you were saying earlier, were filming footage that you knew ultimately wouldn't end up in the film, but you're still capturing that volume and that amount of hours of footage on camera. And so what was that journey of really shaping the overall narrative arc, but also really paying homage to each of these individual subjects in their own way and their own evolution within environmental activism at the same time?
Well, I filmed for a very long time. I filmed a large number of subjects that weren't in the film. And I filmed a tremendous amount of footage. So it was a big job, zeroing in first on the subjects and then on the story. My son, David, was the editor. My other son, Nathan, was the composer of the music. So, family affair. My wife actually does the website and the social media. So everyone but my dog is involved in this. So it was a huge process. It took a long time. I think I had to figure out the subjects first. And once that was determined, then the footage was narrowed down tremendously. And then we had to decide what we were going to include. There was a lot of interesting things that were not part of, didn't make it into the film. We made a 3-hour cut, and then we, narrowed it down and down and down. And, it's difficult to tell. This is essentially 5 different stories, 5 different groups of people, each, doing their own climate activism in a different way. So, yeah, a lot goes into it.
And I love hearing that your wife was actually behind building the website and putting a lot of those details together, because one of the things that you've done with the website is to put together resources and more information about different community groups so that it really continues the conversation beyond just the watching of the film. So when you were making the film and starting to put together a lot of materials like that, what is the conversation? What is the action that you hope it builds into people from the viewing experience?
Well, my goal with this film was to create a film that was inspiring people and energizing people to get into the streets, make their voices heard, and take action for a livable future. I think the first films that came out about climate change were really necessary because people didn't know what it entailed and what was coming in the future. But as time went on, films continued telling people how bad things are and how much worse they're going to get. I myself found those films to be so overwhelming and depressing that I couldn't hardly watch them. I felt obligated to watch them, but they were difficult to watch. And I think that kind of those depressing statistics can be paralyzing. So I thought that perhaps I could make a film that was uplifting if I could follow people who were in the trenches doing everything they could, who were not going to give up no matter what the situation was. And I think those people say it best when they say the alternative to the antidote for depression is to take action, to get involved, to do everything you can. And I think that is true. And also, I think the other thing that's said in the film that's so moving to me is Bill and his daughter are on the couch and they're talking about climate change. And she says, well, change is inevitable. I don't want to be afraid of change. And Bill says, yes, change is inevitable, but are we going to be the authors of that change, or are we going to be the victims of that change? And I think that's what's, the issue here. We need to get involved in great numbers and to make it known that the people in this country and the people around the world understand what's at stake here. Everyone's future is at stake here. And until and unless we get into the streets and make it clear to the politicians that we are not going to accept anything less than a full court press here, then nothing is going to happen, at least in the time frame we need it to happen. So everyone has to step up, get involved. Certainly people do not have to get arrested like many of the people in this film. There's many ways to show your commitment, but everyone has to get involved and join this movement in order to make sure that we get change to the degree that will make an impact in the time frame we have to do that.
I think that's really fantastic and wholeheartedly agree with everything that you just said. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today and for sharing the film with us. Thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Take care.